This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 296 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So I got a question this week from @RNDLion that said, "No, you are against vetoing trades," which is true. But what about someone dropping a good player? Someone just dropped Aaron Rodgers, not on the Yahoo no-cut list, and our league is in an uproar. And then I also got one from @from_the_barn that said, "Due to not performing quarterbacks like Aaron Rodgers, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, I have been losing literally by less than 5 points. Have these stud players become streamers now?" So let's approach this topic on quarterback studs in fantasy football, or more specifically, big-name quarterbacks in fantasy football. Here's what we know about the position in fantasy. It's devalued given the number of usable players who play it, and the fact that you only need to start one. There are other reasons like predictability that help showcase the lack of value, but that's the high-level reasoning. So what that means is that there really are only a handful of quarterbacks each year who are consistent enough to be week in and week out starters. And there are only 1 or 2 of them each season that are giving you a big edge over the competition. The name brand that these quarterbacks have is completely irrelevant as a result. I mean, name brand shouldn't really matter that much to begin with, but it really doesn't matter at a position that's relatively replaceable in fantasy football. I mean, look at reality here. Aaron Rodgers has finished higher than QB 19 in weekly scoring once this season. There are 18 quarterbacks with a higher points per game average than Aaron Rodgers right now. Andy Dalton is averaging more fantasy points per game than Aaron Rodgers. Why on earth should Aaron Rodgers be on a do not cut list? Why are we so attached to Rodgers? Like, I'll give you this. His schedule hasn't been amazing, and better days are probably ahead for Aaron Rodgers. Without knowing the details of the league, I probably wouldn't have cut Rodgers. But you could easily argue that sending him to free agency isn't even a bad move. You're freeing yourself from taking potentially QB2 numbers in your lineup every single week. That's really the key here, I think. When we're so tied to what players have done in the past without looking at how they're currently performing, we start to play suboptimally. This is why I keep bringing up Juju Smith-Schuster on my matchup show. Yeah, he was able to come through last week with a touchdown, but Juju's peripheral numbers right now aren't even close to what we thought that they would be entering the season. And that's for a variety of reasons. The main one likely being the fact that Ben Roethlisberger is no longer his quarterback. But even still, he's being ranked as a solid wide receiver too every single week. But why? So far this season, over 30 wide receivers have a higher target share than Juju Smith-Schuster. He's now playing with backup quarterbacks. You mean to tell me that his talent alone pushes him to that spot? I mean, you can listen back to my podcast over the offseason where I gushed about Juju's talent. And even I realize that this is a situation that you should be fearful of. Like, yeah, Juju can be a wide receiver too from here on out. It's certainly possible. But we also have to recognize that so much of the way that rankers and people are viewing him right now has to do with who he is and what we perceived his role to look like entering the season, not right now. So the bottom line here is this. Look at the numbers. Look at the film. Look at the situation. Don't look at the player's name and assume that he's a good fantasy asset. Before getting to more questions this week, I wanted to let you guys know about this week's FanDuel free roll for all FanDuel Podcast Network listeners. Just go to fanduel.com/league/JJ, my name JJ, make a lineup, submit it, and see if you can win a numberfire premium subscription or even a little bit of cash. That's fanduel.com/league/JJ to enter this week's contest for free. This first question's from @Tampa2Tone. Do you anticipate any offenses shifting gears away from their current neutral game script play calling? Minnesota comes to mind as an example that could start passing more. Yeah, so I don't know about offenses shifting away from their current neutral game script play calling, but I think we need to always recognize when offenses are calling plays in a drastically different way when in neutral game scripts. That's something I try to highlight each week on the 10 Trend Show. So for instance, Minnesota has the second lowest pass to rush attempt ratio this season in football behind only San Francisco, or ahead of only San Francisco. But when games are within 6 points or in neutral game scripts, Minnesota ranks 23rd. This tells us that Minnesota has likely seen some positive game scripts this year, which they have. But it also tells us that if games are closer, we're not going to see a 10-attempt game from Kirk Cousins. This is why I don't mind Kirk Cousins as a streamer this week against Philadelphia. So what you need to do is look at teams who have drastically different ratios overall versus in neutral game scripts. And then ask yourself why. Atlanta, for example, has the highest difference between the two when looking at pass-heavy offenses versus what they do in neutral game scripts. They would be more run-heavy if the team was in closer games. But will they be in closer games? Well, the defense is atrocious, so maybe the answer to that is no. On the flip side, Buffalo, New England, and Kansas City have been far more pass-heavy in neutral game scripts than what their overall ratio is showing. Will that continue? Well, I think that you can make the argument for New England, for example, that with tougher competition, the pass catchers on that team may end up benefiting a bit from a more pass-heavy game plan. So that's sort of how I look at these things. If you guys want, I can publish this chart to Twitter each week as well. Just let me know. This next question is from @RealJoelMiracle. When is it reasonable to start looking at playoff schedules and start making moves accordingly? Example, Aaron Jones versus Chicago week 15 and at Minnesota in week 16. I'm very much a player who always tries to win in the short term because you've got to get there first. But if it's like week 7 and you can sell high on a player who has a tough playoff schedule, an objectively tough playoff schedule, and you're undefeated or something, then that's fine. It's not like you're not getting anything in return. And Aaron Jones is honestly a borderline sell candidate right now. I didn't like his peripherals before Jamal Williams got hurt, and that really helped his cause in fantasy. Aaron Jones wouldn't have done what he did last week if Jamal Williams was healthy. But from a yards to touchdowns conversion standpoint, or when you look at the number of yards that he has versus the number of touchdowns that he should have based on that total, Jones is tops in the league in overperforming in the touchdown column. Now that's not a surprise, and he probably should be overperforming given his usage close to the goal line. But once we hit week 15 or 16, he might be in a committee more than we'd like. That's going to lower his fantasy value anyway. And you guys know that I love me some Aaron Jones. I'm just trying to be realistic. So to answer this question more directly, I mostly look forward to the next 4 weeks or so until a playoff spot is mostly guaranteed. Then I'll do some work for the playoffs. This next question is from @RSJones14. Is there anyone better to buy low on than Le'Veon Bell? Usage is insane. Darnold back means the offense looks competent again, and the rest of season schedule after week 7 is ridiculously easy. Yeah, I mean, if you can trade for Le'Veon Bell at a discount, then do it. I'd be under the assumption that the person who has Bell understands that things haven't been that great because they've been playing with a third-string quarterback. But it never hurts to shoot an offer their way. On the year, Bell has a crazy high 27% target share, and he's seen 88% of the team's running back rushes. He's got elite usage. And with Darnold back, his scoring opportunities should hypothetically increase. This next question says, what is the best strategy when approaching a 1-4 underachieving team in redraft or a keeper league? Stay the course? Sell? 2-for-1s? Is there a particular statistic that can be helpful? Keep up the great work. Love your content. Thanks. So I talked about this a little bit in the past, but I'd really focus on how truly lucky or unlucky you've been so far. In this case, unlucky. Like, do you have a lot of points and you've just faced a lot of big performances? For example, I'm in a lot of fantasy leagues, more than I'd like to admit. And my worst team record-wise right now in redraft leagues is in the Awesemo charity league that I'm doing with other analysts. I'm 1-4 in that league right now. It's my only redraft team without multiple wins. But my team on paper is probably a borderline playoff team. It's not really that bad. I've had some bad luck with injuries, but I'm still right in the middle of the pack in points scored. So I'm trying to make some moves to improve my roster, but I don't think it's necessary to just sell everything off. I don't love my chances of making the playoffs, but selling just to sell doesn't make a ton of sense. Now, if your team completely sucks, then yeah, you've got to make some sacrifices. You've got to give up some of your best players. Be okay with giving those players up. And then the other thing that you can do is look at touchdown regression. Do you have underachievers in the touchdown column who are still getting volume? If that's the case, then your team is probably still okay. But those are the types of questions that I ask. This next question is from @ekicksmk. What are the numbers saying about Joe Mixon? Do you think that he's due for bigger games or should expect the same? The biggest problem with Mixon is that he's not being used a whole lot in the passing game. He has just an 8% target share this year. Now, fortunately, Cincinnati's been pretty pass heavy, but even still, that low of a share won't allow a player like that in a bad offense to be an RB1. And it really is a bad situation. Cincinnati ranks 8th worst in yards per drive this year, and they've run plays within their opponent's 10-yard line at one of the lowest rates in the league. And it's because the offense isn't good. Those scoring opportunities just aren't there. I mean, Mixon's usable because a running back seeing pretty significant work will be usable. but he's become an RB2 this year, given that situation. This next question is from @suspect1983. Rest of season, Smokey Brown or Curtis Samuel? I'm going to go with John Brown here, actually. I talked about him this week on the 15 Transaction Show and how after this week's bye, Buffalo has basically 5 straight games of good matchups. And Brown this year has seen about 2% more of his team's targets than Curtis Samuel has for Carolina. So I think I'd lean Brown at this point, though I don't think that Samuel is a bad player to have. This next question is from @DHeck51. Are both Breida and Coleman viable weekly options? A dip into the San Francisco backfield would be nice. Love the show. Thanks. So yeah, let's dig into this backfield. This past week, we had a 3-headed monster back there with Breida, Coleman, and Mostert. Coleman, coming off his injury, saw 16 carries, Breida 11, and Mostert 7. But it should be noted that Mostert only had 2 carries before the middle of the fourth quarter when that game was out of hand. I think that's good news for both Coleman and Breida. But the way I view the backfield is that we may see Coleman get most of the early down work and probably most of the goal line work, whereas Breida is more of the explosive change of pace guy who's going to find the field more on third downs. The fact that Jeff Wilson saw goal line work when Coleman was out tells you that Breida is probably not going to be that guy. So both players can be usable as long as the 49ers keep playing in positive game scripts. If things go south, though, then Breida may become the better PPR play. This next question is from @Adam_Perky. What's up, JJ? Hey, what's up, Adam? I have an ethics question. If you are winning your matchup going into the Monday night game and your opponent is done, are you obligated to field a full roster and chance someone pulling a Baker to lose you the matchup? You're definitely not obligated to do this because your first priority is winning. You just have to make sure that there won't be any scoring errors fixed, but no, there's no ethical problem in doing this. In the end, it may even hurt you more than anything else, not just because you could lose, but because you're also leaving points on the table for potential tiebreakers. But the top priority is to win. Do what you have to do to win. Sometimes that means benching players on Monday night. This last question is from @TheMikeRager. Hey JJ, love the info and the supporting data. Thanks. One question I have is what wide receiver 3 do you see becoming a wide receiver 1 by the end of the season? Yeah, so statistically, there won't be a ton of players who jump from wide receiver 3 range to wide receiver 1 range. Or at least players who won't finish as wide receiver 1s who are currently wide receiver 3s. But there are a couple of players who are in that range that seem kind of obvious to me. And I'm going by points per game here. But DeAndre Hopkins is the most obvious one. We've seen him consistently perform in fantasy football, and he still has the peripherals to do it. He's still seen a 20% target share or better in every single game this year. So at wide receiver 27, he's an obvious choice. Robert Woods is somewhat of an interesting candidate as well. He's at wide receiver 31 right now in points per game, but he hasn't found the end zone. He's one of the bigger positive regression candidates in fantasy football. And then I guess I should just mention OBJ because of who he is. Like, would it shock anyone if OBJ turns his season around and is really, really fantasy relevant? Probably not. We know he's really talented. But I don't think I see that happening. I think he's more in that wide receiver 2 range from here on out. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave me a rating and review there. Thanks for listening, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.